Welcome to That Crafty Gamer. Today we are going to make a heart container from the Legend of Zelda series, more specifically the containers from the Ocarina of Time. I started out with picking a picture I thought represented the heart container the most from Ocarina of Time, and tracing the two hearts, inner and outer, onto a cardstock piece of paper. After darkening the lines, I cut the stencils out using an X-Acto knife. Once those were taken care of, I could use them to help shape the clay. I started out by handling the clay to help make it more pliable and easier to work with. I then rolled it out using a rolling pin to keep it nice and even, and once I got the desired thickness of the clay I wanted, half an inch for the outer heart and a quarter inch for the inner heart, I could move on to cutting them out. I laid the stencils on top of the clay and cut on the lines using my X-Acto knife. I used silicone-headed sculpting tools to make sure the sides of the hearts were shaped how I wanted. Once I got the hearts how I wanted, I put them in the oven to bake. Using hot glue and cardboard, I made a molding box that would fit both of the hearts while they were baking. Once the box was finished and the hearts were done baking, I set each heart in the molding box using hot glue. Before I could move on, I had to spray the mold box and clay models with mold release. Some mold boxes don't need this, but mine did because I'm using cardboard. Next, it was time to make a mold from the clay hearts. The silicone rubber I'm using has a 1-to-1 ratio, so I simply eyeballed the measurements. I then poured part A into part B because the second is much heavier. I thoroughly stirred the two parts together before pouring the mixture over the clay hearts. After making sure everything is mixed in, we can pour it over the clay hearts. I poured it from a height in order to keep it thin. This helps eliminate bubbles in the mold, especially if you've created some in the mixing process like I did. I dropped the box and tapped on the sides of it to help alleviate any bubbles still trapped inside the mold. Then I set it aside in order to cure. When it finally cured, I removed the box. And pulled the original clay hearts from the mold. Once the mold is finished, I can start pouring the inner heart with resin. This resin is a 1-to-1 ratio as well, so I once again eyeballed the pour. I then put the resin, or the first part at least, into a container of warm water. Not boiling, just warm. This is to help thin the resin out and release any bubbles it has in it. After 10 minutes, I took the resin out of the water and poured the hardener into another measuring cup. I mixed the two and added a cherry red powder dye. I stirred the resin until the dye was completely mixed in. Once I liked the color of the resin, I moved the measuring cup into a bowl of warm water for another 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I removed the resin from the water and stir stick from the resin. I then poured the resin into the small or inner heart mold. When I finished pouring the resin in the mold, I took a small flame to the back of the resin to help alleviate any bubbles left in it. Once it cured, I removed it from the mold and began sanding off a small lip that had formed in the process. When I finally got it to a finish I really liked, I could encase it in the outer heart. I used 2 quarters to suspend it in air while I hot glued a craft stick to it. I then removed the quarters and let the craft stick hold it above the mold in midair. I used the same technique in pouring the outer heart as I did with the inner heart. First, I poured resin into a cup while eyeballing the measurement. Then I sat it in a small bowl of warm water. After 10 minutes, I removed the resin and measured out the hardener. I then added the hardener to the resin along with a drop of blue food coloring for the dye. I stirred for about 3 minutes to evenly mix the blue food coloring and the resin together. After mixing, I sat it once again in a bowl of warm water for 10 minutes. The last step for this side was to pour the resin in the mold that the inner heart hung above. After the first half of the outer heart cured, I demolded it and cleaned up the edges. Then it was time to pour the second half of the outer heart. I used the same technique as the first half of the outer heart. I then placed the half-done heart container on top of the resin and weighed it down with a bolt. Once it cured, I demolded the heart and cleaned up the edges. Then the task of sanding it down to the right size and shape came into play. First, I used the sander with an 80 grit band to shape the edges of the heart container. Then I sanded the faces and edges of the heart with an increasing grit size. I did it by hand for two reasons. One, to make sure I didn't oversand, and two, to keep the face and edges flat.
One eternity later.
The last thing to do is to polish it up. I used a polishing compound and rubbed it in with a tissue. And that's how I made a Legend of Zelda heart container. Please like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.